Good morning, good day to toy collectors everywhere. My name is Scott, Toy Guru Neitlich, a longtime veteran of the toy industry and a toy collector myself. And a big reason I started this channel was to explain some misconceptions about how toys are made. Now, one of my favorite things to collect is Star Wars figures, and one of my favorite fan sites is Jedi Temple Archives. I love this site because they usually are one of the first to report things hitting retail and having links to where you can buy it online, and that's really helpful, and that's why they tend to be on my daily visit. Now, the reason I bring them up is I love this site, but they recently put an editorial up that had some misconceptions. They talked about wondering why Hasbro doesn't just use existing sculpts for 3 and 3/4 or 6-inch figures and just repurpose them. Now, this is actually a fundamental error that a lot of fans make. I'm not at all throwing Jedi Temple Archives under the bus. I'm using their example to point out a larger issue and explain it to the fan base. All right, so what are they talking about here? They're talking about the vintage collection of 3 and 3/4 Star Wars toys. Now, a big thing that fans want, and that includes me, is to be able to have modern updates on vintage cards of all the original figures, meaning these guys, the ones that came out from Kenner in the 1980s, that if you were lucky enough to be a kid in the 70s or 80s, you probably had a schmeckle of these. And it's really fun to be able to see a toy you had as a kid and get a modern update in terms of articulation, but the details about the packaging, the color, the size, the photo, those are really important. Now, for me personally, I just want to see the original 92 or 96, whatever it is, recreated. I don't keep them in package. I open all my figures. So however they're delivered isn't as important to me personally, but for a lot of fans who keep them in package and who collect the vintage series, they specifically want all the figures from the vintage line re-released on vintage cards. So as an example, Luke Skywalker, the original Luke, the Tatooine one, right, from Kenner 1978. So this figure has actually never been done in the vintage collection, which I know seems like, wow, really? Like Tatooine Luke? Yeah, the closest we've gotten is Death Star Escape Luke, which is more or less the same Luke, but the details are a little different. Different accessories, different belt, he has a stormtrooper belt, etc., etc. So, yeah, you can see, they're not quite the same figure. But Hasbro does have a tool, a sculpt, a working, the mechanisms to make this figure, at least they did, because a really good version of Tatooine Luke was released in this resurgence of the Jedi Battle Packs. The problem is this came out over 10 years ago, and as great as this figure is, the tooling to make the figures don't last. And that's part of the issue. The other misconception is the concept of using sculpts for one line and then being able to repurpose them. So let me explain real quick the logistics. This is a injection molded plastic machine. You put a tool inside and out comes plastic shapes that can be assembled into toys, into consumer goods. Usually they're connected by something called a sprue and a runner. This is when you see like army men or where you have to twist them off, and then they have to be assembled. So the plastic comes out of the metal mold. This is what's called the tool. And then the more parts, the more tools you need, and the more expensive the figure is to make. So a figure that has no articulation is a lot less expensive to make than one that has a lot of articulation because more parts have to be generated from this tool. And they have to be large in metal because they have to withstand hot plastic being injected. Now, most tools, honestly, wind up getting sold off as anchors to boats in Hong Kong Harbor. I'm completely serious on this because they're really expensive to store. And nobody really wants to store hundreds, if not thousands, of these giant metal cubes. Even a 3 and 3/4 figure is going to generate a very, very heavy, large metal cube because of all the different parts. And these giant metal cubes, these tools, cost about $100,000 for a fully tooled figure. And that's considered a capital investment. It's not part of the cost of the individual figure, but the upfront fee. And this isn't any different whether you're making a 6-inch figure or you're making a 3 and 3/4 figure. It's the number of pieces that make up the figure that determine the cost. So a highly articulated 3 and 3/4 figure still costs about $100,000 to tool because you still have to make all the different pieces and then get them assembled. That's what drives the cost of tooling, is the number of pieces within the tool. So sometimes, yes, And now once you have that tool, that capital investment, you're going to want to get as much use out of it as possible, which is why you see lots of repaints in the toy industry, because they're paying off this capital investment. You only have to tool it, ideally, once. Now, tools, as I said, they do degenerate, and they do, well, get sold off after years, so they don't last forever. But tooling is different from sculpting. Sculpting, and that's whether you're doing it by hand with, fine tools or toothbrushes or all sorts of different instruments that people who sculpt, or you're doing it digitally. This is a very inexpensive, not inexpensive in the way, bubblegum is inexpensive, but compared to tooling, it's extremely inexpensive. The sculpt is a one-time cost as well, but it is a fraction of the cost of tooling. So yes, you physically can take a digital sculpt and shrink it or grow it to make action figures of different scale. But when you do this, you still have to retool it. So you can't take a tool for a 3 3/4 figure and then just pop out a 6-inch figure. If you have a digital sculpt, yes, you can create a $100,000 tool that will make a 6-inch figure, and then another $100,000 tool that will make a 3 3/4 figure from that same sculpt. But that's where the disconnect is. The sculpts are very inexpensive, again, in relationship to a $100,000 tool. They're not cheap. But you can't just take, for example, Jackson, who had a 6-inch release, and then suddenly shrink him to 3 3/4. You would have to use that original digital sculpt and then recreate a brand new tool at 3 3/4 scale. So you'd wind up with a 6-inch Jackson tool and a 3 3/4 Jackson tool, each one costing $100,000. So the idea that you could just take these older figures that are already sculpted and say, oh, well, you already have the sculpts, just pump out 3 3/4 versions of these awesome 6-inch figures that you're doing in the Black Series. It doesn't work logistically like that, because you still have to buy the tooling. You still have to build the tooling for every single scale you want to do, regardless of whether or not you're reusing the original sculpt. So yeah, the original sculpt, think of it as, just paying some pocket change, a couple bucks, and now you can have a sculpt. But if you want to tool it, if you want to retool it, you want to change the scale, every single time you're going to have to spend $100,000, or, maybe between 50 and 100,000, depending on the number of parts. But it's still very expensive, and you can't just reuse. I hope this video helped explain, because I'm never trying to throw anyone under the bus, just try to explain the logistics of the toy making process, because, well, I hate to see my fellow fans, sort of run a pole up a flagpole, or a flag up a flagpole that, just isn't going to catch wind. Thanks so much for watching. Please do share this video with others. It's the best way to have support for this channel, and I so appreciate it. See you guys in the comment section.